to talk next about teaching the phonology of English, the sounds of the language. And I think most important is when you're teaching the sounds of English to your students, that you teach a natural sounding way of speaking. We don't want students to sound artificial. We want them to sound natural when they're speaking English. So there are 5 areas that I think we need to concentrate on when we're modelling the language, when we're explaining the sounds of English to the students, to help them to really sound natural when they're speaking the language. The first area I think we need to consider as teachers is the rhythm of the language. Now every language has its own rhythm. This means the sound of the language, the beat of the language. So when I said to you, every language has its own rhythm, every language has its own rhythm. There's even a rhythm in that sentence. Every language has its own rhythm. And English is no exception. English is no exception. English is no exception. So when we're thinking about the rhythm of the language, we need to think about the beat of the language. If I say to you, he is from France, and some languages have a very staccato rhythm. English, to my ears, doesn't have a staccato rhythm in that sense. It has a certain timing which students need to master. It has a certain timing that students need to master. So I'd like you to think about, when you're teaching the rhythm, of listening to native speakers or very high-level users of English who sound natural when they're speaking the language, and concentrate on the rhythm of the language. The rhythm's really important when it comes to comprehensibility of the speaker. That if you have your rhythm out of sync, people will not find it as easy to follow you, and you'll sound less native-like and less comprehensible. So listen for the rhythm of the language. The next area I think we need to consider when we're teaching the phonology of English is teaching intonation. Now, in English, we have a typical intonation when we're asking a question. Typically, when we're asking a question, we go up at the end. So we might say, are you French? Is she Spanish? Do you live here? So the intonation can signal to the listener that the speaker is asking a question. Now, even if students that you're teaching get the grammar part of the question wrong, they may get the question type wrong, or they may ask the wrong question form. Very often, if they use the correct intonation for asking a question, the listener of their communication will still understand that a question is being asked. So one of the important areas for intonation is going up at the end of a question generally. Another area which is important for intonation is the meaning of the sentence, the meaning of our communication. A lot of people think that English isn't a tonal language, and it's not, in the sense that Chinese is a tonal language, but we can change the meaning of our communication by emphasizing certain words, by changing the intonation we use in English. Let me give you an example. If I say to you, for example, John has bought a new car. Looking at that sentence, we can say it in quite a neutral sounding way. However, what happens if we emphasize the word John? If we say, John has bought a new car, what's the meaning there? The meaning there is we're emphasizing John, we're defining the person who bought the car. We're saying it wasn't David, it wasn't Paul, it wasn't Susan, it was John. John has bought a new car. So in that sense, we're defining who the person was who did the action. And that's just from the intonation. What happens if we say, if we put the emphasis on the last word, if we say, John has bought a new car, what's the meaning of that communication? Emphasizing the word car. The meaning there is, he didn't buy a new bicycle, he didn't buy a new computer. We're emphasizing the object that he bought. John has bought a new car. And that has quite a different meaning to John has bought a new car. What happens if we emphasize the word here, bought? If we say, John has bought a new car. What happens there? Because the intonation is stressing this particular word, we're telling our listener that it's the action that's important, that it was an act of buying. John has bought a new car, meaning he hasn't hired the car, he hasn't stolen the car, he's purchased it, he's bought the car. What happens if we